Good afternoon. My name is Allison Gampel, and I am the Associate Director of Alumni Programs at York University. Welcome to the second session of our Fall GRADitude Speaker Series, Negotiating Early in Your Career. An especially warm welcome to our newest grads. We know this was not the way you planned to graduate, but you succeeded, and we officially welcome you to our alumni family of 330,000 people. Although we aren't all in the same location, we recognize the many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Guests, if at any time you need help with this experience, please feel free to click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and enter your question. We have a team behind the scenes who is ready to help you with anything that you need. So what is the GRADitude program? If you're new to this, it's a program that provides recent grads with the opportunity to connect with inspiring alumni who have wisdom and stories to share. Today, you can answer a poll question at the end of our presentation for a chance to win one of 4 $50 Best Buy e-gift cards, courtesy of TD Insurance. You might not know that as a York University alum, you can access many discounts and partner offers. And TD Insurance is our home and car insurance partner. So stay till the end of the panel and after the Q&A for your chance to win one of these 4 exciting giveaways. Now, we know that you each came here for a reason, and though we can't see you, we do want to do our best to give you insight and advice that's helpful. So we would like to know what it is that you're hoping to get out of this session. So if you can just take a moment using the Q&A function, please type your response. What do you hope to learn from this session? That just gives us a bit of an idea as we move into the conversation. I'll give you just a couple of moments. Thank you. Learning how to negotiate when you don't have much leverage, certainly appropriate for new grads. Okay. Well, thank you for participating. At this point, I'm honored to introduce you to our alumni panelists, Tanya and Jordan. Thank you for being with us today. Let me tell you a little bit about Tanya and Jordan. Tanya Walker is a trial lawyer who graduated from McMaster University in 2002 with an honors commerce degree, minoring in economics. She then attended York University's Osgoode Hall Law School and received her law license in 2005. She was called to the bar in 2006. Tanya practiced at 2 Bay Street firms before opening Walker Law, which now employs almost 10 employees. Walker Law represents professionals, small to Fortune 500 companies, which includes PayPal. Tanya has always placed great importance on her involvement in the business and legal community. From 2014 to 2016, Tanya was a member of the McMaster Alumni Board. On August 9th of 2016, Tanya was sworn in by the Law Society of Ontario as a bencher and was re-elected in 2019. A bencher, which is similar to a board member, regulates nearly 65,000 lawyers and paralegals in the province of Ontario to protect the public. Jordan Routliff is a senior associate with Walker Law. Jordan received his JD from York's Osgoode Law School in 2018 and was called to the bar in 2019. Congratulations, Jordan. Prior to law school, Jordan obtained a Bachelor of Fine Art and worked for several years as a technical director and account manager in the live entertainment industry. Jordan's practice focuses primarily on property law, and he has worked closely with Tanya in the past 2 years on negotiating numerous settlements. I'm absolutely delighted on behalf of us all to welcome you virtually back to York's campuses. Thank you for joining us today, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Allison. Okay, so if we can, Tanya, just to the first slide. So my job off the top is to orient us, to give you some more housekeeping, unfortunately, but it does need to be done. So that'll be the first 5 minutes. Then we're going to get into the substantive portion. It's comprised of 3 parts. So the first is negotiation strategy and the impact of COVID-19. Unfortunately, we can't avoid that. Then Tanya is also going to, in part 2, give you 4 tips on negotiation strategies. So just give you a toolbox of things to work with. And then I will finish the substantive portion with part 3, which is discussing some contractual terms that you may want to consider in today's environment. And then finally, we'll have an open Q&A portion. And just as a note, this webinar is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to provide legal advice. And last note, we have received some questions in advance. We thank you for those of you who did send those questions in advance. If you have, then we've tried to include it in the slide, and we've referred to you by your initials, so you're not put on the spot. It's anonymous. So Walker Law hosts a series of webinars, and we invite you to join us if you enjoy today's webinar or you want to learn more about employment law or property law, contract law. We host quite a few, and we also store them on our website so you can view some of our past webinars. But our next webinar is in the new year. It's on January 21st, 2020, and it's on employment law. It's going to be hosted by Tanya and our associate Jordan Koenig, who specializes in the area of employment law. So if you want to join, please click the link that we've provided to you here on this slide. So some housekeeping, we've received a lot of feedback in the past on how people like to interact with the presentation and what their preferences are. A lot of people have said to us that they prefer when the speaker is larger. They're not just a small box up in the corner. And so the way you do that is you select side-by-side view. So you go to the top of your screen, you can select the drop-down option and for view options and hit side-by-side mode. And then the slide content and the presenter will be side by side, and you can drag the middle bar to enlarge which one you prefer. So we just had that feedback in the past. If you'd prefer to have our faces a little bit larger, by all means do so. Responding to polls. So for those of you who are familiar with our webinars, you'll know that we're a little bit obsessed with polls and we like interactivity. And so to increase interactivity, you'll be prompted with a series of polls throughout today's presentation. It will pop up on your screen. You select an option and you hit submit, and then we can discuss what your the spread of your answers were and try and focus our presentation on what the predominant answers were. And for those of you who are joining us on your mobile devices, we do encourage you, if possible, to switch to your laptop or desktop. We have been told in the past that the functionality with the polls isn't the greatest on phones. So if possible, we encourage you to transition your device. And going to what Allison said, for those of you who are not familiar, there's a Q&A function where you can submit questions at the bottom of your screen. We've highlighted that icon for you. And again, speaking to what Allison said, right? We'd love to hear your questions and be able to speak to them at the end during the Q&A period. So please do submit your thoughts to us. So objectives. We've framed this presentation around COVID-19 because it's an inevitable reality for those of you, even if you're early stage in your career. It's going to be a hot button topic. It's something we're going to be dealing with for some time to come. So we framed it around COVID-19, but the tools we're going to give you today, you can implement generally as well. We just wanted to touch on the elephant in the room that can't be avoided. So our objectives today are twofold. The first is to discuss the impact that COVID-19 has on how you negotiate. And the second is to discuss COVID-19 contractual terms and how to deal with that. And so that brings us to our very first poll. We're asking you, what topic is of most interest to you? So A, how the pandemic has affected the way I should approach negotiations. B, tips on how to negotiate. C, pandemic paragraphs to put in your contract. Or D, other. And if it is other, please use the Q&A and let us know. So please take a couple seconds and submit your vote. All right, we'll give it another second or two. Okay, let's see what the results are. Okay, so 61%, the overwhelming majority said tips on how to negotiate. Tanya will certainly make sure that you're equipped with a lot of tips by the end of this. So I think we'll be able to satisfy that concern. And with that, I will turn it over to Tanya, which brings us to the first part of our substantive portion.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you, York University, for having us here today. So in this section, we will describe how negotiations have changed due to the pandemic. We will also discuss errors that are commonly made during negotiations and provide tips on how to improve negotiations. Now, the pandemic has caused uncertainty and has changed the way that we are used to doing business. We are used to negotiating while physically sitting across each other in the room, and now physical distancing is the norm. Even if you are in the same room, you may not even be able to see the other person's expression because he or she might be wearing a mask in addition to yourself. This uncertainty and change in how we negotiate is probably what caused you to register for this webinar today. So typically, we learn about a negotiation strategy called BATNA, and that stands for the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It looks at trying to get the biggest bargain for yourself or else walk away and seek other alternatives. The problem is that many of us do not have any other alternative. So this section will explain the traditional negotiation style and how that has changed now we are in a pandemic. Excuse me. So the main question that we will answer in this section is, how have negotiations changed during these uncertain times? So I'll start off with an example, and then I'll ask you to answer a question in a poll. So make sure you pay attention. So looking at this chart, I'll just explain it to you. You are thinking about buying a car. You go into the dealership, you don't even really want to purchase a car, and say the car is a 2010 Honda Civic. So you go into the dealership and you think to yourself, okay, this is my price, my range to purchase the car, right? And it has to stay within that range. Other things that you're thinking of is, it's a pandemic, I don't really want to be shopping around, I don't really want to be outdoors, and I just want to just move on, I have a million other things to do. Now, the dealer is trying to sell the car and may think to him or herself, well, I don't really want to have too much inventory. I'm concerned about the future. So I really need to get rid of this as much inventory as possible. And why do you even decide on a purchase price? Because you have enough education to know how much it should cost. You know, a 2010 Honda Civic should not cost $100,000, but it shouldn't be $5 either. So when you go into that dealership, looking at your bottom line and the bottom line of the range of the dealer, which is in this circle, that's called the BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. You want to stay in that range. And same thing with the dealer. The dealer does not want to go here, which is the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, which is probably, $5. And you don't want to go here, which is your worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, which means you pay substantially higher than what you wanted to. So you go in there, you negotiate, and then you get to your bottom line, and then you think to yourself, you know what? We're $200 apart now. Why don't we just split the difference in half and move on? So you actually end up paying $100 more than you anticipated. So with that example, what do you think of this negotiation? So this is a poll. Nothing, it's fine. B, it didn't take into consideration the long-term relationship of the parties. C, it did not take into consideration other ways to increase revenue or decrease costs. Both B and C, unsure, or none of the above. Could you please vote? And we'll give it a few more seconds. perhaps we could end it. Yep. So the number one answer is B and C, which is D. 46% of you believed it didn't take into consideration a long-term relationship or other ways to increase revenue or cost. And second place is C, and unsure. You didn't take into consideration the other ways to increase revenue. And some of you are unsure or say none of the above. And if you have any thoughts on why it's none of the above, or if you're unsure, have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. So the answer is D. So going back, the majority of you got it right, which is not taken into consideration. You're looking at the short-term view. And I have personally taken this approach many times when I settle a case for my clients. We are in a settlement negotiation, trial's about to start in a day or two. And my client says to me, you know what, Tanya, I'm tired. I have too many things to do. Why don't we just divide the difference in what we're looking at and let's just move on. So these negotiations, such as the settlement instructions that I receive from time to time, they get you your car. But the problem is that it fails to take into account long-term considerations and relationships. And you also paid $100 more for the car than your bottom line because you just want to move on. So if you had engaged in some kind of discussion and with the dealer and looked into each other's interest, you might have disclosed that other family members are looking for cars. They're in the market to buy a car, and your friends, and maybe you can encourage them to buy or purchase a car from that dealership. That might have gotten you a price less than your bottom line. And also the dealer might have let you know there's a car, a newer model car that could go for the same price that what you're willing to pay if you're able to find more buyers for that dealership. So not looking beyond your immediate needs or even the contract is a standard way to negotiate a contract. You're looking for the best deal for you and you only, and you're only looking out for your objectives. So usually before you negotiate, you complete your research. You approach it with logic. In the car example, you knew how much the car should cost. When you're looking out only for your bottom line in a pandemic with very few options, your emotion may come into the equation. Just like the example where you paid $100 more for your car because a part of the thought process is I don't want to venture out to other dealerships and possibly get COVID. That's the same thing what happens with negotiations for contracts or even employment contracts. You sign on the bottom line or the dotted line because you are concerned that you may not get any other opportunities in the future, or it's just too stressful and you just want to move on to the next step in your life. So logic really with the contract negotiations, it should override emotion. You should focus more on your facts, your analysis, your math, your education and research. And as trial lawyers, that's what we do with our clients. But the problem is that you're supposed to minimize emotion panic with negotiations. And that might be more challenging due to the uncertainty and lack of alternatives. So with emotion, biases, fear, desperation come into play. Because in a pandemic, you're worried you may not achieve your goal, such as finding a job, signing that contract. You're desperate to get into a contract will be common in an environment, and that will influence the logic of your negotiations. So what happens with increased emotions? Now, this heightened emotion leads to the main mistake that I have seen when negotiating because people may be in panic mode. And I'm speaking from personal experience really since March. And what I see is really three things. The first is someone signs a contract that they're not happy with. So that they agree to a reduced price or a reduced salary. And then thinking post-pandemic, because we're not going to be in a pandemic forever, that reduced price or price that you're offering for your product or services or your salary will become permanent. And so if you sign on to something that you're not happy with, you may not approach your end of the bargain wholeheartedly. Number two, you may not fulfill the terms of the contract at all because you may sign a contract for a job. A better one comes down the road 2 months later, and you say, okay, I'm leaving. I'm just going to go with that new job. Number three, you may miss renegotiation opportunities. If you do not think long-term, you may think, okay, well, I'll just sign this contract and keep looking. But if you thought more about logic, you might say to yourself, Okay, I'll sign this contract and with a stipulation that we revisit it in 3 months or 6 months. So what's the biggest change that I've seen with COVID-19? The biggest change with contract negotiations is the need to approach it holistically outside the transaction. There's uncertainty, scarcity of opportunities, and a general inequality in bargaining power that arise from the pandemic. And so you need to possibly entertain the thought of negotiating in a different way, especially if you're the party with the weaker bargaining position. For routine negotiations, skilled negotiators can get away with being very reactive. The issue with this approach is that you relinquish control and create an unstructured negotiation environment. Right now, I suggest that this is not the right approach, especially given our current economic and business climate. When it comes to complex deals, the emotional or reactive approach should be avoided as much as possible. So now I'll get into part two. The majority of you are interested in this point. Your toolbox. What tips or tools can you carry in your toolbox for negotiations? What negotiation strategies should you consider? Now, when negotiating, especially if you're the one with less bargaining power, I suggest you rethink your counterparts. For example, that car example I provided to you, the two people were only thinking of each other and the competition. By doing that, they overlooked others in the ecosystem surrounding the negotiation. So step one, when you deal with goals, and this is the way that I suggest you might want to encounter or deal with a contract negotiation, think about your goals outside of the contract. What business objective would you like to achieve? Increased revenue or salary, decreased cost, for example, working from home, so you save the cost on commuting, cost financially and health-wise. So what kind of goals are you interested in holistically outside of the contract? And when I usually schedule a negotiation, I usually ask the person to consider sharing with me, if they're comfortable, what are their goals? Even outside our negotiation, what are their goals holistically? And an example of this is I had a negotiation with the other side, and I know the other side, the other lawyer. I've known that lawyer for quite some time. And so I said, think about other goals you have that you're comfortable sharing with me. And that person actually said to me on the phone, I'm actually interested in purchasing gym equipment. And that was outside of our file. But because that goal was shared with me, I was able to make an introduction to someone else that sold the other side gym equipment. So when you're thinking about their other side, when you ask the other side to consider their goals, try and develop the exercise where you might think of what their goals may be as well. Because when someone comes to the table and shares with you their goals, you might be able to say, okay, well, those are your goals, but I thought about it to myself, and wouldn't you be interested in this? Or wouldn't you be interested in this kind of introduction? And it could be as simple as an introduction or decreasing costs or increasing revenue. So when you are in that meeting, once you thought about your goals, you ask the other person to think about theirs, and you've also considered their goals, and you sit down in that meeting, listen, don't interrupt, and have that person share with you what their goals are. Take notes, and while that person's talking, think about what can I do to help that person achieve their goals. Even companies. Some companies I know of, if they're smaller companies, they may not be very savvy with social media. Digital marketing is very important right now. We are not going to be able to meet new clients or be introduced to new people through conferences, lunches, or dinners. So someone who's not as savvy with social media might really be happy if you are able to offer some assistance with that. So that's something to consider. And keep in mind the amount of time it takes to negotiate when you approach it this way. It's not as quick as when you walk into a dealership, you haggle over price and you move on. It takes quite some time, so you need to budget time for this. I would also recommend, if you are going to negotiate, try and do it by video conference as opposed to the telephone. Jordan and I argued a court proceeding by telephone when COVID started. And I found that although I was familiar with the judge, it was very difficult to have a discussion with her by telephone because I couldn't read her expression. So that leads to my conclusion on step number 1. Before you negotiate, don't even talk about your negotiation first. Just have a discussion about your goals and the other person's goals, and possibly think about how you can help that person achieve their goals, and take the contract outside of what your wants and needs. And so a question that has been asked before is how to prioritize what is important in a negotiation and the immediate long-term needs of a team and of the organization. My answer is a brainstorming exercise, and don't block the brainstorming, just write it all down. And then you can say, okay, these are our short-term goals. These are long-term goals. These are goals that might not be achievable right now, or we might have difficulty achieving them. And these are goals that are easily achievable. So moving on to step number 2, scope. When goals are discussed that may lead to a change in the scope of your contract, and you are then open to, okay, I can assist this person in this manner, you may want to be flexible in how you define your business relationship or your contract with the other side. It may not be just, okay, salary. It may be, okay, salary plus a bonus if these deliverables are provided. And so the problem is when we're confronted with an opposing party who seems to have more leverage, we try and find that we can weaken that leverage by saying, if you don't pay me this much, I'll walk away. But the challenge with COVID is that we don't have as many options, or none at all, in order to walk away. So really, it's offering more opportunities and try to have that as part of the relationship or the contract. And that will help build the relationship and put you ahead of the competition. For example, and this doesn't necessarily mean actually widening the contract. It could be narrowing the contract. And I'll give you an example of this. A few months ago, someone approached our firm and said that I want to terminate my lawyer and hire you. And I asked, why? Is there an issue with competence? And that person said, no, the lawyer is competent. And I said, okay, so what's the problem? It was explained to me the problem is that I'm started a lawsuit. I want my money. And my lawyer is moving very, very slow in terms of getting us to the next steps in order for me to get to trial so I can get an order for money. So I looked at the matter and I saw it was a combination of securities law and employment law. We don't practice securities law here. And then, so that would require us to learn a new area of law. It wouldn't really be productive. So I then made a suggestion and said, instead of us taking over that relationship, why don't we work with your existing lawyer so we can deal with the employment area and your lawyer can continue on the securities area, and we can kind of push from behind in order to get you to where you need to be. And so our clients then said that works for me. And so my co-lawyer and I, we meet periodically by phone or video conference to discuss steps in the matter. But because we have a reputation for pushing our matter to the end, especially if we represent the person who is suing the plaintiff, it works out well for everyone. And that's narrowing the scope of the contract, not completely taking over, just taking over a certain aspect. And so we need, in terms of doing that, you really, really have to think about the needs of the other side. And sometimes you have to say, what do you really need help with? What is really the problem here? So that answers the question, how do I negotiate effectively despite challenges in the pandemic? Think about how you can offer value. And if you can offer value over someone else, you're more likely to be selected. So the third point is leverage. Many questions that I've had to address lately dealt with leverage or lack of leverage. And I actually saw somebody already wrote that in the Q&A. This is pressure that you may feel to accept a contract or not negotiate because you're in the weaker position. In this step, based on your knowledge of what you want and what the other side wants and what you can offer to the other side outside of the contract to give them what they want, you can use this as leverage. I was also asked a question about how do you deal with that negotiations when you're a woman? How do you deal with negotiations if you're a visible minority? I'm both. And so before I give you my answer, I just want to give you the findings of research from Kellogg Business School and Harvard Business School. And they both found that in a test group of visible minorities that negotiate, the visible minorities negotiated less aggressively because they perceive themselves that they would be discriminated against. But on the other hand, when it was found that the negotiators were negotiating with visible minorities, some of them perceived them to not be entitled to what they were asking for and didn't give it to them. So when a potential client wants to retain our firm, I don't really, and wants to negotiate fees, I don't know if the negotiation is just based on that person being a negotiator, race, or gender. I have no idea. But all I do is focus on the value that we offer. I know what our competitors charge. I know that what we charge is a market rate. I know that I have more experience than many of my peers. I've argued many trials in the Court of Appeal. I'm on 4 television stations. And so I also have my first degree is in business, so some business acumen. And that's all the leverage. That's all I focus on is the value that the client may get. So a number of you seem to be interested in employment type of related questions. And I want you to consider that every company has a goal. Most of these goals are to decrease expenses and increase revenue. And so you may want to consider, what does your employer need outside of the contract that you can offer? Is there anything that you should offer to assist your employer with achieving its goals? If your employer is a financial institution, for example, there may be a concern about revenue and expense for that institution. Is there anything you can do to assist your employer with respect to that concern so you can justify a pay increase? For example, is there a high visibility project that you ensured was completed under budget and on time that you can say, this is leverage? So even though you may believe you are in a weaker bargaining position, offering something to help the other side achieve its goals, even if it's outside of what you directly could do for them, may give you leverage. So that's what I say in terms of negotiating a pay raise or an employment contract. Focus on the value. Last point here is timing. Act quickly. So negotiating in a pandemic is very stressful. We're in an uncertain time. We're in the second wave of COVID right now in the GTA. And despite what I say, others may take a long time to negotiate with you because they know that you may not have any other options, or they may not even want to negotiate with you due to your lack of options. So if this happens to you, I suggest to use any idle time that you have to increase your bargaining position. Discuss timelines and the importance of timelines. And so I'll give you an example of this. I graduated from McMaster University in 2001, quite some time ago. And during that time that I was interested in graduating from that school, I graduated a semester early. September the 11th occurred. And when September the 11th occurred in the United States, I was devastated. I had so many job offers and interviews that during that time, and as soon as September 11th rolled around, I was told by many of these huge companies, we want to hire you, but we have to put that on hold. There was only one company out of many that said, we'll extend an offer to you. I thought at that time, it doesn't really make that much sense to me because the salary you pay a new grad is very small compared to the revenue that a Fortune 500 company brings in. But I accepted that one job offer. A few months later, a few more companies said to me, Tanya, we've been given the green light. We want to extend an offer to you. And at that time, I couldn't accept any offers because I knew at that point that I was accepted into law school. But had I not been accepted into law school, then I would, and I was interested in leaving that current position, I would have definitely said, I have a couple more months of work experience under my belt right now, so I want to negotiate salary. So my point to you is, if you're waiting for an offer or someone is taking their time negotiating with you, use your time wisely and see what you can do to build relationships, build your portfolio to put you in a better position to negotiate. So looking at some of the questions at the bottom is, when is it best to bring in legal representation in the negotiation process of a business contract? I would say before you sign on the dotted line. You can have your negotiations, But when when you've come to terms on what you want to sign off on or what you agree on, you should have a corporate lawyer. And we're not corporate lawyers, we're trial lawyers. We deal with disputes. Prepare one for you. So question from P and A, how do you answer a question about desired salary in a job application versus an interview? This is where education comes into place. You should have an idea of what the market rate is for a job application when you apply and also in the interview. And if you're really unsure, I've seen this when I've interviewed candidates to work at our firm. When I ask, what are your expectations about salary? The answer that I usually receive is whatever the market rate is. And I usually think that's satisfactory. So literature about negotiations. One book that I read quite some time ago when I opened this firm 10 years ago was Getting to Yes. Getting to Yes doesn't necessarily deal with the pandemic, but it teaches you how to negotiate, and it helps put you in a situation where you're just not feeling too stressed. And so I really do recommend reading this book if you are interested in learning a bit more about negotiations. So now Jordan will speak about contractual terms in part 3 of our presentation.
Thank you very much, Tanya. So this is the last portion of our substantive, the substantive side of this presentation, and then we'll be moving into the Q&A. So I'll try and work through this quickly so we can have more time to have a discussion. So just to start this off, we have 2 questions that we've dealt with in the past, but we thought it was worth rehashing them. They are really relevant and they do get asked a lot. So they both pertain more or less to verbal contracts. The first is, are there benefits to a verbal contract as opposed to a written contract? And the second is how to address parties who change their minds and try and change their commitments throughout the negotiation process. So speaking to the first one, as trial lawyers, we will tell you absolutely in no world should you rely solely on a verbal contract. They are technically valid and binding, but the problem is you have to prove them. And that's the rub. It's notoriously difficult to prove a verbal contract. You have to bring in all kinds of circumstantial evidence, and the judge really has to make a finding of credibility. So really avoid it, right? Do what Tanya said. When you've reached the terms, you really should have a lawyer, sit down, draft a contract for you. Or if, that's not making sense in the circumstance, at least try and draft something between the parties so that makes sense. Going to the second question, if you're afraid that when you're dealing with somebody, they're going to change their commitments throughout the negotiation process in a business transaction, we always recommend that you try and use what's referred to as a memorandum of understanding. It basically is a non-binding document that tracks the agreed upon terms, which will eventually form a formal and binding contract. It's a good way to avoid situations where people backtrack and change their minds about agreements that have previously been reached throughout the negotiation process. Next slide, please, Dana. So one term that we get confronted with a lot these days, or we hear about a lot these days, is a force majeure. So the literal translation of force majeure is superior force. And what it is basically is an event that is beyond the party's control. So the parties had nothing to do with it. And it could be, for example, a pandemic. So if you do have a force majeure and it references a pandemic, you or the other party may be permanently or temporarily relieved from certain obligations under the contract, assuming a pandemic was contemplated in the term. So this brings us to our poll. So here's a scenario. Your supplier is saying that your contract with them contains a force majeure, so they do not need to supply you items until the pandemic is over. What do you do? A, find an alternate supplier. B, nothing. C, insist that the supplier deliver the items. D, unsure, or E, none of the above. And if it's E or D, please submit your thoughts in the Q&A. So please just take a quick second to vote. Okay, I think probably wrap it up and see what the, okay, so the first one was find an alternate supplier. That's the highest ranking vote, so A, and then the next one is insist that the supplier deliver the items at 40%. So can we go to the next slide, please? So the answer is actually E, none of the above. And it goes back to the first slide, which is you need to examine the term to see if it applies to the situation, right? So in that scenario, the party was citing a force majeure based on a pandemic. Is a pandemic actually even contemplated in the term, right? That's your starting point. It could be that it's not, in which case it doesn't apply and you're left in the same place you were beforehand. So E, none of the above. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is a little bit of an explanation on how to utilize a force majeure or apply it to the scenario, right? So not to sound like a broken record, I do apologize, but the first step is, does it apply, right? So you have to look at the language and ask yourself, is a pandemic contemplated? The classic scenarios that are contemplated, you'll see strikes, lockouts, war, labor disputes, things of that nature. Very likely that we'll see a rise in language that references a pandemic. So first, step one, does it apply? Step two, if it applies, what are the consequences? So one common misconception when it comes to force majeure clauses is that they essentially bring the contract to an end, right? It's game over, everybody walks away, nobody has to do anything anymore. And that is simply not the case. Oftentimes what happens is this term will simply modify the party's obligations, right? You may be relieved from some, you may in fact incur others, right? In the event of a force majeure. So you have to understand what actually flows, what the consequences are of the term. And then finally, how do we address the activation of this term? So this is really what today's presentation is getting at and what that question is getting at. How do you deal with the counterparty citing a force majeure? And this goes to what Tanya said, right? Get on the phone and negotiate, right? So some of you answered find an alternate supplier or insist that the supplier deliver the goods. That's missing the relationship, right? You're missing the long-term impact that those actions would have on the relationship and your business opportunities. So get on the phone, ask them, what can we do to work this out so that we don't have to follow the term by the letter, right? Oftentimes people just want to find something that works for everybody and keep the relationship intact. So, get on the phone, figure out what they need, try and leverage some outside opportunities to keep the relationship alive, as opposed to just shooting it dead on the water, arguing over the application of the term. And with that, we'll go to the next slide. So we really want to impart what we view to be the golden rule when it comes to force majeures. So we have a case here, Fishery Products International and Midland Transport. So basically in this case, the trucking company tried to conflate or say that a protest was similar in nature to a strike, and therefore the force majeure applied and the contractual obligations were modified as a result. And what the court said was, no, a protest and a strike are two very different things by definition. A strike is a formal mechanism used by labor unions generally to raise a grievance, whereas a protest is just an organized demonstration. Anybody can organize a protest that has nothing to do generally with labor conditions. So the judge said, I'm not going to imply things for you, right? And this is the golden rule. Events will not be implied. If you want a specific event to be contemplated by the force majeure, you need to put it in there, and you need to put it in there with very, very clear language. And we'll go to an example just to. So a lot of the questions we have with respect to this presentation are around employment. And you often hear that we live in the gig economy now, right? You don't really have what you used to where everybody was an employee. Now there's a huge uptick in contract work. And so it is possible that you enter into a contract where there's a force majeure, right, in favor of the person hiring you. So here's an example. Should a force majeure event occur, the employer shall be permitted to terminate the contract without notice. So the issues with this, this is just one example, but the issues that we see with this very basic scenario is, one, there's no notice, right? So they're saying if the force majeure is triggered, I can just can the contract, have a nice day. I don't even have to let you know. So, look at these things critically, right? Maybe the compromise is to add a notice period. So that way you at least have 60 days to try and find a new contract, right? And then what are the events being contemplated, right? For example, if the business is e-commerce and you work remotely, as is the case with those businesses nowadays, would it make sense to have a pandemic cited as a force majeure event? Because chances are, if it's e-commerce, everybody works remotely, a pandemic is going to have absolutely zero impact on what you do. But if the pandemic is contemplated in the force majeure, you're still faced with it, and the employer has the right to raise it, right? So you have to make sure the scenarios that are being contemplated fit the job that you're doing. And that goes to our question: do you believe that agreement should have a force majeure? It's really case by case dependent, right? Doesn't always make sense. If it does make sense, then it should be contemplated. So you have to look at the relationship and think about what's going on in the employment context. If you are an employee, there are temporary layoff provisions in the Employment Standards Act, which essentially would, more or less give the employer the power that they might seek through a force majeure otherwise in order to lay people off in economic hardship. If you're a contract worker, on the other hand, probably makes sense to, make sure that a force majeure is, you're keeping your eye out for that. So you really have to pay attention to that. And with that, we went a little bit over time, so we'll wrap it up. Do apologize. And we'll go to our Q&A period.
Wonderful, Jordan and Tanya. Thank you so much. And certainly it was really helpful that you addressed so many of the questions that were submitted already by our students and our recent grads in preparation for this. So we really, really appreciate the wealth of information that you've just shared. Certainly personally useful. Wish I'd known this when I was just graduating from university. So we do have the option to our guests to type in questions. The Q&A function is where you would type them in, and then I'll ask the questions on your behalf. So please do feel free to submit some questions. I think we have 2 there, so I'll start there. So the first question that I'll ask is from JK. In the fishery products example, did the clause speak to events outside a party's control and just list a strike as an example?
Yeah, so in that case, there were multiple, right? So there are usually standard scenarios that are contemplated, like war. I mentioned is kind of a quintessential one, which is really, thankfully in this day and age, unlikely for us in North America, but nevertheless is in there. So, in that case, the essential element really is that it has to be a scenario that is actually, in fact, outside of the party's control. So in this case, it was a supplier and an employer, right? And there was a strike event in the middle of that. Neither of them had any hand in organizing or triggering the strike, right? So the essential element is the scenario needs to be outside of their control. If it's inside their control, then it's not a force majeure. Full stop.
Got it. Thanks for that. So a question that came in earlier, and I think it was Tanya when you were talking about the BATNA. There's a question about some of the assumptions that makes. So I'll just read it to you and let you take a stab at answering it. DB writes, this BATNA assumes that I have perfect information on what that specific car should cost, asymmetric information. Further, it assumes that individuals act rationally. So I guess the question is, how do we address that in a real world rather than in a world where these assumptions are there?
Well, thank you for that question, Allison. This is the reason why I suggest in a pandemic, BATNA doesn't really work. You have to really focus on a holistic approach because you don't have perfect information. People are not necessarily acting rationally because they're worried about the future. And you may not even be thinking rationally because you're worried about the future. You're worried about having a job, much less negotiating a contract. So that's why I mentioned it's very important to kind of put BATNA aside and focus on a holistic approach when negotiating a contract.
Thanks very much. So imagine that I got a job offer right now, And, how would you suggest that I approach negotiating it? It's my only offer. It is a pandemic, and I do have some debt to repay. So how would you suggest I would approach that negotiation?
My suggestion is, well, it would depend if it's a large company or a smaller company,
Mm.
but regardless, companies all have needs and wants, right? So my suggestion is, if you're a new graduate and you receive a contract and you want to negotiate it, is perhaps before you start to negotiate it, you speak to the person that has extended that offer to you, or human resources, and say, I'm interested in this offer, but I want to know, before even negotiating it with you, what is it that the company needs? Does a company need like a social media person? Because that's something that I have time to learn. Does the company need an introduction to another supplier? Because I checked my LinkedIn and I have a second connection to this potential supplier for you. What do you need? And then if you can try and negotiate that way if it's appropriate. But if you are unable to negotiate that way, but you decide to sign the contract because you don't really have any other offers, perhaps you can say, could we have a discussion about my deliverables? How many billable hours do you expect? Do you expect me to sign up for a board? What are your expectations of me? And can we put that down in writing? And if possible, could we revisit this in perhaps 6 months? Because we don't know where the economy is going to be and where the pandemic is going to be. And then you work on not just achieving it, surpassing those deliverables. So then when 6 months rolls around, if we are in, knock on wood, the third wave or whatever, or we're recovering from the pandemic, then you can say, here are my deliverables, A, B, C, D, and E. And here's my chart that shows that I exceeded all my deliverables. You asked for 100 hours of billable time. I gave you 200. You asked for these introductions, one introduction, I provided 3. You asked for someone to help you with grant applications, because there's tons of grants out there, and I'm a strong writer. Due to my submissions, the company was able to achieve 3 grants. So you put that on paper, and then you can say, I know I would like to suggest or request an increase, and here are the reasons why, because I have these deliverables and I surpassed them. And it's going to be as an employer, it's going to be very difficult to say no.
Right. And I would imagine at that point that the employer has already invested a good amount of time and resource in training and getting that employee up to speed.
Yes. And the cost of turnover is very high. So from an employer perspective, because I am one, it makes sense to even give a minimum raise for a very good employee, as opposed to being difficult and that employee leaves and you're stuck trying to replace that employee and retrain that employee. It usually costs, on average, about $10,000 when you deal with turnover of employees. That's from an employer perspective.
Wow, that's pretty expensive. So what I'm hearing you say is, when you have an opportunity now, because the market is kind of tricky, to take it, to work really hard, do your best, and then perhaps consider approaching negotiations a little bit later in the game.
Right, and give the other side a heads up. Like, I wouldn't just say 6 months from now, let's meet. I would ask now, would it be possible for us to schedule a meeting in 6 months, so everybody's in the same kind of frame of mind? And then you just work as hard as possible so you can deliver.
That's a great suggestion. Now, whether you're negotiating, now, or whether you're negotiating 6 months into a new job, is there anything other than money that new grads or new employees can negotiate on?
My thoughts are yes. There's so many, like, new grads are exposed to a different world compared to people who have been in who have been working for 30, 40 years. And so like blogging and the social media, there are so many grants available. Somebody needs to help prepare those grants, training. If that new grad has a skill set, even if that new grad is new to the job, they can train people on that skill set. There's just so much that new grads can offer. And sometimes I find that new grads underestimate how much they can offer, but it's it's kind of, I can't even count how many ways new grads can provide assistance to a company.
Right. Yeah. So it's really important that that you all don't sell yourself short. Understand the value of what you're bringing to the table. I'm going to take a final question, which is regarding online negotiations. And I think you said earlier that it's better, to speak face to face or on camera when you can. I know in working with students for many years that students can be so shy. So what suggestions do you have about negotiating? Negotiating in itself is difficult. And then coupled with, the online environment, what suggestions do you have?
Turn your camera on. So that's what I suggest. I have spoken to, and I've conducted interviews where the person says, I didn't really comb my hair this morning, so I'm not going to turn the camera on. Just throw it in a bun if you have longer hair, and turn the camera on. Let me see you, because I need to see your expression. I can't have a fulsome conversation with you if I can't see you. So if you turn on the camera, and if you have like a negotiation where you're just emailing back and forth, oh my goodness, so much can be read into a tone of an email or a text message. Pick up the phone, like Jordan said, and just call and have a discussion. When COVID started, we negotiated with a lot of our suppliers to put off some of the payments because we didn't know what was going to happen. The courts weren't operating at the rate that they are now. And I didn't do any of these negotiations on the phone. By email. I sent an email asking, may we have a conversation on the phone or by video conference? And that's what we did. But it makes a big difference because context is everything. Like as a lawyer, the facts make such a big difference in the outcome. And that's how it is with life, right? So people are able to see and hear where you're coming from. They might be less likely to be offended than if they just read an email. Sometimes you might hit the caps lock by accident. Someone's like, oh my gosh, you're yelling at me. And you didn't really mean to yell. So I think it's very important to make it as personal as possible. And like I mentioned, the judge, I've known that judge for many years, and I found it even difficult providing my submissions on the telephone, but because I couldn't see her face. So just keep that in mind. Keep the perspective of the other side in mind as much as possible. And if you do receive a contract and you want to have a discussion about it, perhaps just ask if you can have a video call, or at the very least a telephone, instead of just going back and forth on email, because then it's not as personal.
Wonderful. Well, that concludes this conversation. Thank you, Tanya and Jordan, so very much. You've answered all of the questions that students pre-submitted, as well as the ones they submitted online, and many of mine. So thank you. I plan to certainly bring some of your tips home when negotiating with my tween daughters.
Well, thank you for having us. This was great. It's great to share our knowledge, and I hope it's helped some of the people that have attended. It's just a different way of doing things. And this may not be a temporary change. This may be permanent.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here with us. We really appreciate it. And we wish you health and success in your work and your negotiations as you move forward.
Thank you.
So I will allow you to turn your cameras off and just conclude with the draw that we have for our students. Okay. So to our new grads, our alumni and friends who are here with us today, if you have any feedback for us, if there was anything that you found particularly informative, please feel free to use the Q&A button and send us your feedback. You can also send us feedback at any time at alumni@yorku.ca. And now from our wonderful partner and sponsor, TD Insurance, this is your chance to participate in a poll to win one of 4 $50 Best Buy e-gift cards. So the following poll should appear on your screen. And let's see if it does. And those of you who answer it and answer it correctly will be eligible to win one of those gift cards. So what's the most likely way to save on car insurance? A, combine it with home insurance. B, use your alumni preferred rate program. C, install winter tires. Or D, all of the above. I think you've probably had enough time to answer that. Thank you very much. We will notify the winners after the event by email. Good luck to you all. And by way of conclusion, please feel free to share today's talk with your friends. It will be posted on the York Alumni YouTube channel. You can also join our LinkedIn group, follow us on Facebook, by searching York University Alumni. We're also on Instagram and Twitter at YorkU Alumni. If you want to learn more about the alumni community, our website is alumniandfriends.yorku.ca, especially to our recent grads, our class of 2020. We are building programming for you and are really eager to hear what you want from us. So please connect with us on any of our social channels or at alumni@yorku.ca. Join us next week at our final fall GRADitude session. It's taking place next week, and it's about money matters. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful, safe, and healthy rest of your day.